want to say thank you to President Lindsay and to Professor Howard and to Mr. Graf for inviting me to come and join you here at Gordon over these days to talk about things that I think really deeply matter, certainly for my generation, for your generation. Thank you to Professor Brink for his generous introduction. When I sat down in the pews a little earlier, I suddenly felt as though I were back in a church to which my family and I belonged 10 or more years ago. Actually, the congregation in which Professor Brink's wife grew up in southern Ontario in Canada. And I was troubled because I couldn't figure out what it was that made me feel like that until I noticed that the hymnals on the back of your pews have covers of exactly the same color and grain as the Christian Reformed Church's Grace Psalter hymnal. And so that was a really weird kind of sensory experience for me there for a moment. To those of you who attended the previous lecture that I gave, I must apologize because I will not be making any reference during this talk to zombies. And so if this had in any way been advertised as a talk on zombies, that will not be the case. Thank you to Hannah for reading the scripture passages that inform my thinking about our topic. We are all in this together, slow politics and intergenerational justice. These three small passages from the scriptures suggest to the people of God how we might live among our neighbors in such a way that we can pursue the common good. In the letter that Jeremiah has dictated to himself to send to the people of God in exile in Babylon, the instruction includes that people should live in such a way, people who love God, people who believe in God, should live in such a way that they can contribute to the welfare of those communities where they find themselves in service or at home. There's a similar theme in the letter that Paul writes to the people of God in the city of Rome, so city of Babylon, city of Rome. Instruction is that we should live in a way that's peaceable. We should seek the peace of our neighbors. We should try and be contributors to a shalom in some approximate way in every particular societal setting where we find ourselves. And then there's the vision of the prophet Zechariah that suggests that when we do that, when we live peaceably with our neighbors, when we seek the shalom of the communities in which we find ourselves, then instead of finding ourselves in a relationship of intergenerational strife, we will find ourselves in a situation of intergenerational peace and justice. Now, these biblical instructions find the people of God throughout the centuries, wherever we are. How might they apply to our particular situation? I think it's helpful to bring these teachings of the scriptures against the backdrop of the whole story of the Bible, which I will not recount, to bear on a particular problem that we have in our moment. And the problem was brought perhaps most amusingly to my attention by a rather bad novel. Albert Brooks has made a few movies. He's a comedian, humorist, no relation to the best of my knowledge to Arthur Brooks, who spoke here on this campus a few days ago. Although Arthur Brooks is also rather funny, I thought. But I do hope that Mr. Brooks, should he ever, so this is Arthur Brooks, should he move on to a career as a novelist, I don't know if any of you have noticed, but he had a preceding career as a French horn player. Now he's a executive of a really influential think tank in Washington, D.C., and so may well go on to write novels. I hope he writes better novels than Albert Brooks. But apart from the fact that that 2030, the novel by Albert Brooks, fails to sustain interest past, say, the first two-thirds of the book, it opens up painting a scenario of the future of the year 2030 in quite an engaging way. In the imagined future of 2030, there has been found a cure for cancer and a number of other major medical advances, which has allowed people in the America of that imagined future to live much longer than we currently do. And so the need for services provided to the elderly has significantly increased, and along with that, the costs of providing those services. And so in the year 2030, in Albert Brooks's vision, not a prophetic vision in this case, but a satirical vision, there are increasing tensions between the young and the old, because the resources of government are dedicated so considerably to the needs of older Americans that there are scant resources available to address the needs of younger Americans. And because of that, there's a growing feeling of anger and disaffection from among the young, who are unable to find jobs, who have limited access to health care, who find the infrastructure of their society ever decaying, because the federal government does not have the financial resources really to take care of all of its responsibilities. Now, this vision of Albert Brooks is not simple science fiction. It's in fact premised on very accurate information about what is going on with regard to the federal treasure in America today. However you want to cut the facts, if current trends persist, which of course they never do, but if current trends persist, then the federal government of the United States of America will find itself in a situation somewhere during the 2020s, so not that far away, where it can do very little other than pay the interest on the debts that it has incurred and take care of those entitlement commitments that have been made to people who are due to receive Social Security payments and people whose healthcare needs are to be met by means of Medicaid and Medicare. And so really the hands of the federal government will be tied, will be unable to provide in many of the ways that we currently expect of it to provide. And if that were to be the case, then the trend that Albert Brooks previsions is not at all that hard to imagine. It's not that hard to imagine that a current generation of Americans will think that they have had the future stolen from them by their elders. My own generation, I'm a Generation Xer, we've already been quite cynical about what the boomers have done to us. Your generation, if these trends continue, is likely to feel a similar sense of chagrin with regard to that which has been taken from you in terms of possibilities of action on the parts of government, and a whole range of other possibilities by my generation and the generation that precedes mine. If that's how you are to feel, then we're facing a future of intensifying intergenerational conflict and strife, because the interests of different generations conflict with one another in this scenario. Now, how are we to think about this situation against the backdrop of what we heard from the scriptures? I have a few suggestions. And first, I want to think about the key principles, a few beginning guidelines that help us think about the ways in which we can seek the welfare of the political communities in which we find ourselves. To think about the expression, the guidelines that might guide our expression of the biblical instruction that we are to live peaceably with our neighbors. 3 general remarks about this. To seek the peace or the welfare of the communities in which we find ourselves means, I think, that we must do justice. We are called to love our neighbors, and I think in the context of political community, the political word for loving your neighbor, I think, is justice. I think one of the things that Christians can learn from what the Bible teaches us is that justice is not optional. Now, I've said this on a previous occasion in this room, and so I will repeat myself, trusting that this will not bore you too excessively. But when I was a young believer, as Professor Brink mentioned, I grew up in South Africa. I'm a 10th generation South African. I grew up in an intensely unjust society. People like myself lived lives of considerable privilege because of the color of our skin. Our neighbors, a great majority of the people in our country who had a different color of skin, did not enjoy any of the privileges that I enjoyed. And so, based on racial differences, apartheid South Africa during my youth, 60s, 70s, and 80s, was a tremendously unjust society. When I came to faith in Christ during my mid-teens, I started reading the Bible. I came to faith reading the Bible. My girlfriend of the time, now my wife, gave me a Good News New Testament, and in the reading of that Good News New Testament, I encountered Jesus. And encountering Jesus brought me into a relationship with God by His grace. And since I had read the New Testament and had been profoundly changed by it, I thought I might as well continue and read the Old Testament and see what happens if I do that. And as I read through the Old Testament, the passage that challenged me more than any other passage in the Old Testament scriptures was to be found in Isaiah 58. I remember the day that I read Isaiah 58. It is a passage in Scripture where the prophet says to the people of God, if you're coming together to worship God, singing your songs and bringing your offerings, and then you go out and you do injustice to the vulnerable and to the poor, you're not worshiping God at all. You're just play acting. Worship equals justice. Justice equals worship. Belonging to God demands of us that we do justice. Justice is not optional. To me, reading that passage as a young white South African who now belongs to Jesus was like being hit on the forehead by a hammer. Realizing that I had to change my life. I had to do something. I had to participate in the struggle against apartheid. That was not optional. Justice is not optional. That's true for us also. This morning I ran into Professor John Skillen, and my understanding of justice has been profoundly shaped by his brother, Jim Skillen, who was the founder of the Center for Public Justice, which is where I'm a senior fellow. And one of the things that I love about Jim Skillen's vision of justice is that he paints a picture of justice as symphonic. I'm delighted that we have the chairs of a symphony orchestra between us this morning. It brings wonderful memories and terrible memories to me. I played in a symphony orchestra when I was a teenager. I played the viola badly, probably because I never practiced. But sitting across the orchestra from me was the lead violinist, who was hot. And so you could imagine my delight when I, in February of 1982, had a phone call from Angela to invite me to go dancing. I'd never been on a date at that time. So symphony orchestras have terrible memories for me. Those moments when I was flustered and trying to page through my music, wondering where the orchestra might be, which page are we on, which is a common experience for violists. And those moments when I could look across the orchestra and see this gorgeous girl with whom I was in love, and to whom I'm now married. So symphony orchestras have wonderful memories for me. But I love symphony orchestras because they are the very picture of justice. So in the one corner of the orchestra, you have violins playing usually the lead melody of the symphony piece, a very specific voice that the violin has, a very particular sound. It's playing a particular melody. In another corner of the orchestra, you have the very patient player of the triangle, counting, waiting, ting. So each of these instruments have this distinct voice. The conductor, in this case, Gustavo Dudamel, the magnificent Venezuelan conductor of the LA Philharmonic, brings together all of these voices, all of these tones, various melodies, and it makes a beautiful harmony rather than a discordant cacophony, playing to a normative score. In our society, justice is that situation in which each of us as an individual and collectively grouped in our various communities have the opportunity to bring to full expression that to which God has called us, to bring our voice into the symphony of our society. The task of the state is to provide a legal order of harmony that allows all of our differences not to exist in discordant cacophony, but in a rich social harmony. That's what justice sounds like. Among the harmonies that justice must effect is a harmony among the generations. Justice is intergenerational. To do justice does not simply mean that we as a political community must figure out how we, at this moment, must live together. We must also consider what we receive as a legacy from those generations who have built our political community up until this day. And we must consider what legacy we leave for the generations to follow. Justice must be intergenerational. And so we have to consider, when we make decisions as a political community about how we are going to use the scarce and valuable treasure of the nation, contributed by citizens who by the sweat of their brows earn and then give as a tax to the government for our common purposes. How we manage that in such a way that we do not overspend, that we achieve the proper outcomes of justice with the resources available to us, and that we do so in such a way that we don't reap the benefits while our children and our grandchildren must bear the costs. We have a responsibility for intergenerational justice. So if these things are true, justice is not optional, justice is symphonic, and justice is intergenerational, what must we do? To do justice, we have to build institutions. Justice is not just something that you wake up in the morning and you talk with your buddies and then you do justice. It's hard work, and it requires complicated institutions. The American political order is a wisely articulated order in which we have a variety of institutions which exist in a precarious but harmonious balance with one another in such a way that justice can be effected. I know that this is New England and that people have a historical commitment to the town hall where the people of the town or the village or the local community get together and they figure out how they're going to do justice in a sort of a face-to-face way. But here we live in a political community of hundreds of millions of people. To bring about a harmonious justice requires complex institutions, which we must build. A political community consists of government and citizens. It's not just government. One of the weird things about Americans for me as a newcomer is that Americans love America and they hate the American government. Love the flag, hate the president. It's a strange kind of thing for me, because this is part of our community. We're a political community of government and citizens. We must treasure these institutions, which, yes, over generations are built so that they have the solidity of stone, but that really, in the big perspective of history, have the fragility of spider webs. So to do justice requires a commitment to the building of institutions. Justice is not just something that governments do. Justice requires active citizenship. To do justice means that we as citizens have a responsibility, a vocation, a calling to be actively participant in the decisions and the conversations that shape our political community. People on the left in America are unhappy about the Tea Party movement, and people on the right are unhappy about the Occupy movement. But both of these movements are expressions of active citizenship, and as such are appropriate responses of citizens to their vocation. Not just to sit in your hands and pay no attention, not to just maybe occasionally read an op-ed piece in a newspaper, if that, not just to vote, which you must do when you can, but to be actively engaged in citizens. If we as citizens are not involved in shaping the political life of our political community, we are not contributing to doing justice. But justice requires patience. A Christian politics is a slow politics. I would not go so far as to call myself a member of the slow food movement, but I have friends who are. The slow food movement is a global movement. On December 10, they will be celebrating Terra Madre Day. And they're a movement of people who say that fast food destroys our bodies, destroys our local economies, and destroys the planet. And so we need to cultivate a commitment to slow food, where we understand where the food comes from, where we stand in relationship to its producers and to the land from which it comes, where we eat well, enjoying both the fragrances and the flavors and having good effects for our bodies, and where we eat convivially in such a way that we bring about community. Just like slow food, I believe we need slow politics. So much of our political life, if we are politically engaged in America, is like fast food. It's fast politics. You get snippets of opinion from a television set, and you get all riled up, and you want things to quickly change, and that is not how the world works, and it's not healthy for us as individual citizens or as a political community. Christians are called to intergenerational patience, working at making our political community peaceable and seeking the welfare of this nation and its neighbors, so that we can have, instead of intergenerational strife, intergenerational justice. And so that we might give some small expression to Zechariah's eschatological vision of a world in which old men and old women shall again sit in the streets, and the streets of the city shall be full of boys and girls playing. This, a picture of a park where old men are playing chess and children are gambling around them. It's not just a picture that points us towards the world that God will restore, but it's a picture of what it looks like when we seek justice, because it brings about a situation in which this can be real. Thank you.